My name is Autumn. I'm 34 years old. I live and work in New York, a place where dreams can come true, and also where I realize that sometimes reality is stranger than imagination. That morning, I sat in a silent room at a law office in the middle of Manhattan. No sunlight, only cold yellow lamps casting shadows on wood-paneled walls, and eyes sharp as needles fixed on me. My mother Evelyn sat across from me, leaning back in a leather chair as if she were hosting a gala, not attending a will reading. Beside her was my sister Crystal, her blonde hair curled perfectly, her smug smile always ready to mock anyone who wasn't her. In front of the lawyer and dozens of relatives, my mother coolly declared, "Crystal deserves everything. Autumn is nothing but a burden." I didn't respond. I kept my eyes on my hands resting in my lap, outwardly calm, but inside my bag was the handwritten letter and file Grandpa Richard had given me in private. No one in that room knew the truth lay there, and it would completely overturn what they called the family plan. Have you ever been openly cast aside by your own family? Have you ever been called a burden at the very moment of grief? Leave a comment below if you've ever felt disregarded or pushed aside in your own family. And if this story stirs something in you, don't forget to like and subscribe to follow along, because what's coming next will keep you hooked. I remember clearly what it felt like when I was 6, curled up in the cold laundry room, my little hands scrubbing the floor with an old rag. On the other side of the closed door, Crystal was laughing in the living room, clutching her third birthday gift of the day, a singing doll in a crisp white lace dress, the very toy I used to dream of having. My mother sat on the sofa sipping tea, stroking Crystal's hair, her face glowing as if Crystal were the only light in her life. I had no cake, no one congratulating me. My mother only said one thing: "You should feel lucky you still get to live in this house." I didn't cry, not because I was strong, but because I had already learned that tears changed nothing in that house. To her, I was always a burden, slow, born to fail. Crystal, on the other hand, was the golden child. Anything she did, no matter how small, was praised as if it were extraordinary. Once Crystal spilled orange juice on the carpet, and my mother laughed, patted her head, and said, "Kids will be kids. How adorable." But when I accidentally broke an old glass in the kitchen, she screamed so loudly the neighbors heard and banned me from dinner for 3 nights. So I learned silence. I learned to step lightly so I wouldn't bother anyone. I learned to swallow every sigh when Crystal flaunted another new toy while I wore hand-me-downs for 3 seasons straight. No one asked what I liked, what I wanted. Even the day I was accepted into the advanced program at school, my mother dismissed it with, "What good is being smart when you don't have the looks?" Through it all, only Grandpa Richard truly saw me. He didn't coddle or praise, but every weekend when I visited him, he'd make me a cup of cocoa and nod toward the old shed behind the house. "Go fetch the black notebook from the top shelf," he'd say, his voice steady and calm. At first, I didn't understand. But then he began showing me, page by page, expense tables, savings plans, small investment charts he'd drawn by hand. He taught me how to read a balance sheet, how to check interest rates, how to anticipate risks. It wasn't easy for a 10-year-old, but he was patient, and I absorbed faster than anyone expected. One autumn afternoon, we sat under the maple tree in his yard, leaves swirling around us. He said, "Don't ever think you're the leftover. The most important things are never kept where they're easy to see." I didn't fully grasp his meaning then, but I remembered every word. At 15, Crystal got a shiny pink bike from my mother to ride to school. Me? I still walked through 3 neighborhoods, in blazing sun or biting wind. Crystal had dance lessons, piano, painting, whatever she wanted. I cooked, cleaned, ran errands, and studied late at night after everyone else was asleep. Each night I heard my mother laughing with Crystal in the living room while I studied the math problems Grandpa assigned me. I didn't have a real childhood, but I had something more important: the will to endure, and a teacher no one expected. At 18, when Crystal had a grand graduation party at a hotel with dozens of guests, I had a quiet talk with Grandpa in his small office. He handed me a tiny brass key and said, "This unlocks the bottom drawer of the safe. When the time comes, you'll know what to do." I didn't ask questions. I only hugged him tightly, something I had never done with my mother. Grandpa Richard passed a year later. The family was in chaos at the funeral, but not from grief. My mother whispered about his house. Crystal inspected the paintings on the wall to guess their value. I just stood still, staring at his smiling picture framed among white chrysanthemums, silently promising, "I won't let you down." Since then, I've kept my distance from them. I moved to New York for college, worked night shifts, saved every dollar. I didn't go home often, but whenever I missed his voice, I opened his notebook, studied the formulas and notes, and practiced as if he were still beside me. My mother still sent occasional holiday messages, always ending with lines like, "Don't expect help if you go bankrupt up there." Crystal posted pictures of parties, cars, and cosmetic surgeries. I'd glance, then delete, not out of anger, but because I expected nothing from them anymore. And then the will reading came. Crystal walked into the law office, draped in fur, red stilettos clicking on the floor. My mother wore an expensive suit, her eyes sharp, ready to devour anyone who stood in Crystal's way. I arrived on time, silent, with an old canvas bag slung over my shoulder. Inside was the sealed envelope Grandpa had given me 4 years before. I didn't know what waited, but I understood one thing. What he left behind wasn't for show. It was a test of loyalty and resolve. I sat down, facing the two women who had always treated me as nothing more than a shadow, and I waited. Not to fight, but to witness the truth, whether they could accept it or not. I moved to New York at 21, carrying an old suitcase, a handful of plain clothes, and the leather notebook Grandpa had given me. Inside were his notes, scattered lessons on economics, finance, and careful quotes he had written in steady script. Endurance is not weakness, but the ability to hold on when others let go. Life in the city was never easy. I worked as an assistant at a small architecture firm in Brooklyn, by day following my boss to construction sites, by night studying for project management certifications. I ate more instant noodles than hot meals, slept more on couches than in beds. My first apartment was barely big enough for a single bed and a desk. But to me, it was freedom. I didn't call home. No one was waiting. Holidays I spent in the library or sketching designs. My mother never asked how I was. Crystal occasionally texted, "You still stuck in that dump?" She was different. She lived as if born to indulge. Her social media glowed pink with summer yacht trips in Miami, brunches in Manhattan, dinners with boyfriends at Michelin-starred restaurants. A new dress every week, a new man every month, hundreds of likes and comments under each post. What stung wasn't her glamour, it was my mother's pride when she shared Crystal's posts with friends. "If only you had half of Crystal's charm, you wouldn't live so miserably." She said that once when I came home at 23 to visit Grandpa. I didn't reply. I just set down fruit and vitamins on the kitchen table and walked into Grandpa's room. He was weaker then, but his eyes were sharp, his voice warm. "Are you doing all right?" he asked, notebook still in hand. I nodded. "I'm studying corporate finance management. My company wants to grow in that area." He smiled faintly. "Good, don't stop." We didn't say much, but he always made me feel seen. I kept working relentlessly. After 3 years, I was promoted to project lead, securing our first contract with a restaurant chain. I paid for my certifications myself. I still lived simply, still rode the subway, still tracked every expense in the notebook Grandpa gave me. I never borrowed a single dollar. I saw colleagues crumble under pressure, quit, or take shortcuts. But I never allowed myself to. Not to prove a point, but because I believed that if I kept going, Grandpa would be proud. Meanwhile, Crystal and my mother lived in their own world. Crystal became an influencer, advertising makeup, clothes, food. Every video she posted, my mother shared on Facebook with long captions about her talented, accomplished daughter who knows how to live. No one knew the luxury trips were charged to my mother's credit card, or that the designer bags were gifts from short-lived flings. I didn't care. I had no time to compare. When exhausted, I sat on the rooftop of my tiny apartment, sipping tea the way Grandpa used to make, remembering autumn afternoons under the maple tree. That silence was a luxury my family had never given me. I only returned home a few times each year, usually on Grandpa's birthday. I'd visit his grave, lay down white chrysanthemums, then stop at the old corner store for the peppermint candy he loved. I never stepped foot in the main house. Crystal and my mother were always throwing noisy parties, full of guests and heavy with pretense. Once, walking past their living room window, I saw my mother beaming, raising a glass to toast one of Crystal's deals. Everyone applauded. I walked past quietly, and yet I never felt left behind. I had something they could never understand: inner steadiness. During those years, I began opening the sealed envelopes Grandpa had left in the safe. Legal documents, carefully signed stock certificates, investment contracts, all in his name, each with a blank line left for the successor. I didn't rush to sign anything. I spent every weekend evening reading, studying, and asking advice from friends in the industry. An old friend introduced me to an attorney who specialized in family wealth management. Together, we went through every detail, making sure everything was stored and updated legally. I told no one about it, not my mother, not Crystal. To them, I was still the dull older sister who would never amount to anything. They had no idea I was slowly preparing to take over part of the fortune Grandpa Richard had quietly built for 40 years. I never thought about revenge, but I believed in preparation, and when the appointment at the law office was set for the will reading, I understood. Everything Grandpa had arranged was reaching its final chapter, and perhaps it was time for my silence to finally speak. Grandpa Richard passed away on a gray September afternoon in New York. The drizzle fell endlessly, as if it would never stop. I had just finished a client presentation when the hospital called. The doctor's voice was as soft as a breeze. My grandfather had passed in his sleep, his heart stopped, no pain. I stood frozen in the mirrored hallway, my chest hollow, not from shock, but from a wave of emptiness that washed through me quietly. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in my small apartment, staring at unfinished design drafts on the desk, then at the photo of him on my bookshelf. His eyes always held something hard to name, a quiet wisdom, sometimes sadness. I thought of the afternoons on his wooden porch when he taught me about the flow of capital, how to manage risks, and how to keep dignity in silence. Those lessons had now become memories. The funeral was held a week later at an old funeral home on the outskirts of Albany. I arrived early, wearing a simple black dress, no makeup, no one with me. Evelyn came 15 minutes late, holding Crystal's arm. They walked in as if it were a society debut. Crystal wore a form-fitting ash-gray dress, her hair styled in elaborate curls, high heels clicking sharply on the marble floor. My mother walked beside her in the same cream-colored suit she had worn at Crystal's birthday party the year before, pressed to perfection. When her eyes brushed past me, she gave a slight nod, no hug, no words of sympathy. They spent most of the service chatting with Grandpa's old acquaintances. Whenever someone mentioned how much Richard loved his eldest granddaughter, Evelyn smoothly redirected. She tries, but Crystal was always the one he truly counted on. I didn't argue. I sat in the back, quietly looking at the framed photo surrounded by white chrysanthemums, where my grandfather smiled serenely, as if he saw through everything. 3 weeks later, the Gilbert Marsh law firm sent a letter scheduling the will reading. I received it one late afternoon while finishing a quarterly report. The italicized words on the white paper weighed heavily. The office representing the late Richard Evans cordially invites Ms. Autumn Evans to attend the final will presentation at the request of the deceased. I arrived at the law office at exactly 8:30 a.m. The large conference room was lined with walnut wood, black and white photographs on the walls, the air thick with tension. I sat on a leather chair by the window, clutching the bag at my side where Grandpa's letter rested. Crystal and my mother entered minutes later. My mother took the seat at the head of the table, eyes fixed on the lawyer, as if ready to sign for the table. Inheritance. Crystal, as always, chose the chair beside her, back straight, lips painted bright red. She smirked, leaned in, and whispered, "I hope Grandpa didn't divide things up too much. I hate sharing." I said nothing. I kept my eyes on the gray-haired lawyer opening the thick file before him, his hands trembling slightly as he turned the first pages. "We will begin as requested by the late Richard Evans," he said evenly. "This will was drafted 6 months ago, legally certified, with 2 witnesses, and signed in full clarity of mind." My mother nodded, her voice pressing. "Yes, please skip to the main assets. The house, land, bank accounts. I'm certain Richard left everything to Crystal." The lawyer showed no reaction. He opened the first page and read aloud, "I, Richard Evans, being of sound mind and acting of my own free will, draft this will with the intent to distribute my assets fairly, reflecting the value and responsibility each family member has shown." My heart tightened. He continued, "I leave the house at High Bay Murmolt Maple Lane, along with all personal belongings, decorations, and wine collection, to my granddaughter Crystal Evans. I also leave $80,000 in my savings account at Albany Trust to Crystal, as a token of family affection." Crystal turned to my mother, her eyes glowing. My mother squeezed her hand, smiling in satisfaction. "You see? He loved you most." The lawyer set the file down, looking toward me. As for Autumn Evans, both my mother and Crystal turned sharply. Crystal raised an eyebrow, expecting perhaps some old furniture or a worthless plot of land. The lawyer opened a thicker folder, pulling out a large stack of papers, along with a pale yellow envelope sealed with red wax. "Miss Autumn is granted full legal ownership of Richard Evans's private investment portfolio, including inheritance rights to company shares, control of 3 independent trusts, and management authority over cider, real estate projects he built over the last 30 years. Crystal burst out laughing so loudly the lawyer paused. "Excuse me, did you say investment portfolio? You mean paperwork? No house, no cash? Just a pile of old papers?" My mother chuckled too, her tone dripping with scorn. "That makes sense. Autumn has always been suited for boring things." I didn't answer. I took the envelope from the lawyer, my hand trembling slightly. Inside was the file I knew well from years ago, documents I thought I was only allowed to review, never inherit. Beneath the stack was a handwritten letter, Grandpa's script clear and steady. "If you are reading this, everything is ready. You have learned enough to know value doesn't lie in possessions, but in the ability to master them. Use this to build what you believe is right." I folded the letter, drew a deep breath, and looked up. Crystal whispered to my mother, "It's just papers." "Worthless." My mother nodded, not realizing the ground beneath her had just shifted. I still remember the weight of flipping through those thick pages the lawyer handed me. Special paper, blue ink signatures, bright red notary stamps at the bottom of each page. None of it was unfamiliar. I had organized, corrected, even scribbled notes on many of those documents when Grandpa prepared for meetings. But what stopped me cold was the very last section. An annex transferring inheritance of all shares and management rights, signed by my grandfather and 2 independent attorneys, sealed 3 months before his death. The room was so quiet, I could hear Crystal's uneven breaths and the turning of paper. My mother's brow furrowed. She turned to the lawyer, her voice strained. "You mean all the business assets, I mean? His private investments are left to Autumn?" Attorney Gilbert nodded, pulling out another thick binder, this one with a plastic cover titled Evans Holdings, Legal Assets and Share Portfolio. The late Richard Evans was founder and lead investor in 5 companies, including 2 real estate development firms, a data management technology company, a private equity fund, and a luxury housing management system operating across 3 states. Current net asset value is estimated at approximately $22 million, not including projected profits from 2 upcoming projects next year. Crystal let out a sharp, disbelieving laugh. My grandfather drove a beat-up Buick for 10 years. He wore sweaters, Mom knitted. He lived in that little brick house in Albany since I was a kid. And you're saying he had more than $20 million? Crystal, quiet, my mother snapped. She leaned forward, both hands on the table, forcing her voice calm. That's impossible. Richard never told me about any investments. I handled his expenses. If those companies existed, why wouldn't I know? I met her eyes directly. Because he didn't tell you. He told me. Her hand clenched the strap of her bag, eyes wide. What? I kept my tone steady, though each word peeled back years of memories she never cared to see. For 8 years, I went back to Albany at least twice a month. I sat with him for hours, listening as he broke down investment strategies, expansion plans, and legal filings. Did you ever once ask what I did with him? Crystal slammed her hand on the table. You're lying. You went there out of pity, because you had nothing better to do. I turned to her. You think that because you never asked. Attorney Gilbert folded his hands, voice even. Ms. Autumn was not only listed in the inheritance documents, she co-signed many major investment contracts, attended legal meetings with me and Richard for the past 3 years. Every record is filed and verified. The succession process has been gradual, legal, and valid since Richard chose to step back from active management. My mother shook her head over and over, frowning deeply. No, he couldn't have kept something like this from me. I'm his daughter. The lawyer didn't argue. He quietly slid a set of documents toward her. Mrs. Evelyn, I'm sorry, but Richard stated clearly in private meetings why he withheld financial information from you. One of his concerns was your lack of transparency in managing money in the past. Crystal jumped in. He said my mother wasn't transparent? What do you mean? I sat silently, letting the air grow colder around them. The lawyer opened another file this time, a list of personal loans under my mother's name over the last 10 years. Some had been covered by Richard's personal accounts. There were even transfers labeled as loans for Crystal's art school tuition, but the funds were rerouted to Evelyn's credit card. My mother's face went pale. She leaned back, exhaling sharply, then jabbed a finger at me. You made him do this. You were always jealous of your sister. You tricked him. I didn't shout. I didn't rage. I only spoke clearly, each word deliberate. I didn't make him do anything. I was simply there when he needed me. You, on the other hand, were busy using his money to keep up appearances. Crystal said nothing. She stared down at her nails, pressing them into her palms as if trying to wake from a nightmare. Attorney Gilbert closed the file, his tone calm but final. Every document is complete, with third-party verification. There are no grounds to question the legality of this transfer. I looked toward the window, the pale autumn light streaming through the glass. Outside, the city bustled on, everyone rushing through their lives. Inside that room, the definition of place in the family had been turned upside down, and none of them had been ready for it. I didn't react when my mother suddenly jumped up in the middle of the boardroom, pointing at me as if she were exposing some shocking truth in a courtroom drama. Her voice pierced through the cold silence that had settled after Attorney Gilbert revealed the full inheritance documents. You brainwashed him. What were you doing those 3 years in Albany? You tricked him. You turned him against his own daughter. Crystal swung toward me, her eyes burning with a mix of hatred and panic. You staged all of this. He was manipulated by you. That so-called transfer of ownership, how do we even know it's real? I stayed seated, my hands resting lightly on the closed file. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to justify myself. Everything that needed to be said was already there in the legal seals Grandpa had left behind, and in the memories of the very people now trying to erase the truth with their anger. When the meeting finally ended, I left the law office behind me, along with their calculating stares, but I knew it wasn't over. And as expected, 2 days later, a post began circulating on social media, stirring up the family circle and old acquaintances. Crystal had posted a photo of me leaving the will reading, captioned, "Some people are willing to betray their own blood just for money. Does anyone still believe in morality?" The comments were filled with sneers, insults, and suspicion. Relatives who had barely spoken to me before jumped in with lines like, "I can't believe Autumn would act this way, and Richard must not have been in his right mind when he signed that will." I read every line. I didn't feel sadness, but a chill. The chill of realizing how easily people believe a story told by someone who decorates lies, rather than the one who quietly built truth. Then I got a call from Vivian, my mother's cousin, who had gone to school with me years ago. Her voice was worried. "Autumn, your mom just told the family that you took your grandfather to sign papers when he was weak and not in his right mind. Honestly, I don't know what to think. Are you okay?" I drew in a deep breath and answered, slowly, "Aunt Vivian, I'm fine," and he signed everything completely lucid. There's video, there are medical competency evaluations, and even doctor certifications. "They just can't handle the truth because it's not what they expected," she sighed. "I know you're careful, but you also know Evelyn won't let this go. She's already hired her own attorneys, Mitchell, Crane. They specialize in inheritance disputes." I sat quietly in my small apartment, the afternoon light hitting the coffee table where Grandpa's letter still lay like a reminder. I wasn't surprised. Evelyn wasn't just skilled at putting on a show at parties, she knew how to manipulate people's minds with her own script. A week later, I received a summons from civil court. Evelyn and Crystal had filed a petition to nullify the will, claiming the heir exploited the relationship and exerted undue influence over the testator while he was in poor health. I brought the letter straight to Attorney Gilbert. He read every line carefully, then looked up at me, his expression calm, not surprised at all. "We've already prepared for this." Richard was thorough. "In our files, we have a neurological evaluation from his private physician 6 weeks before he signed the will, video of the signing session with 2 independent witnesses, and even an audio recording Richard left on an encrypted drive." I exhaled, relieved, though my chest still felt heavy. Not because I feared losing, but because it felt like standing on a stage surrounded by an audience, ready to throw stones simply because, in their eyes, the villain refused to collapse. Crystal, meanwhile, carried on her war online. She posted tearful stories about the trauma of being robbed of everything by her own sister, with photo collages of family gatherings, painting me as jealous since childhood. At extended family events, I was ignored, treated like a shadow that brought shame to the room. I didn't react. I kept going to the office. I kept reading through the files of the companies Grandpa left behind. I kept meeting with financial advisors, legal teams, HR managers, preparing to take control. Under the fluorescent lights of the small conference room, I learned to read revenue reports, understood market shares, analyzed potential risks. I had no time to like or comment on anything online. And it was during those long hours of work that I began to see clearly what Evelyn and Crystal had never touched: responsibility. No one can fake leadership when faced with balance sheets, with employees waiting for paychecks, with contracts that must be signed on time. Wealth can be fought over. The ability to manage it is something else entirely. I still shop for groceries the same way, still cook dinner every night, still slept on the same simple bed I had bought 6 years ago. But every morning I woke now. I wasn't just working for my own future. I was working for the legacy of the one person who had trusted me, even if he never said it aloud to a crowd. My mother could hire more lawyers, rally relatives, and keep lying. But she couldn't change one unshakable fact. I was there when no one else was. And I was the only one who understood that he hadn't left me just assets, but a living system, a system running, creating value every day, a system that couldn't be controlled with tears or social media. I found the key in the last envelope, tucked between two pages labeled Evans Trust, Personal Asset Reserve, Appendix B. A small brass key, unmarked, with only a note in his familiar handwriting. The safe upstairs, bottom compartment. Open only when you are truly ready. I stood before the attic door of his Albany house. The chill seeped through the wooden frame, dust thick on the banister, everything frozen in time. Each step creaked like memory itself. The heavy safe was hidden behind toolboxes and old files. I crouched, slid the key into the lock, and turned it gently. The click was so clean, it startled me. I had expected old investment duplicates or trinkets he wanted left untouched. Instead, inside was a thick navy blue folder sealed in waterproof plastic, a leather notebook, and a small hard drive. I pulled up a wooden chair, sat down, and opened the file. The first pages were bank statements, First Atlantic Credit, Empire Capital Lending, even a small bank in Nevada he had rarely mentioned. Large loans, $80,000, $120,000, then $50,000 more. The borrower, Evelyn Evans. The guarantor, Richard Evans. My chest tightened. These statements stretched nearly 8 years, never once mentioned in the official documents I had reviewed with him. Some pages had handwritten notes, payment overdue, loan restructured, penalties accruing. But worse was a mortgage under his name, signed with a casino credit company in Atlantic City. Evelyn had used his name to secure loans and never repaid them. I lifted the leather notebook. On the inside cover was a short line. If you've found this, it means you're strong enough to understand. Each page carried his meticulous notes, the dates Evelyn called asking for money, the amounts, the excuses she made up. Some pages had receipts of cash transfers, marked when he had to sell company stock just to cover her debts. His handwriting was steady, disciplined, but in between the numbers was a silent weariness. She never asked if I was okay, he had written on one page. She only asked if I could sign again. I closed the notebook, my hands trembling. All those years, Evelyn loudly claimed to care for him. She had been slowly draining what he had built. And the reason he had excluded her from the inheritance wasn't anger, it was clarity. He knew if she controlled the fortune, it would be gone in a few gambling seasons. I opened the hard drive. Inside was a single folder labeled Legacy. Recordings. I played one, and his voice filled the attic deep, deliberate, as if telling me a story on the porch again. Evelyn, for a time I believed she was just lost. But when I saw her forge my signature to borrow from a casino, I knew I was wrong. Autumn, if you're hearing this, remember, not every relative can be trusted with responsibility. Blood does not equal trust. I sat there for hours, the weak light seeping through wooden slats, dust drifting in the air. His words stayed with me like water trapped in a cracked vessel, unable to spill, unable to leave. That night, I drove back to New York with the files and the notebook. I met Gilbert the next morning. He read every page, silent for a long while, then finally said, "Autumn, this isn't just evidence to defend you. This is the very reason Richard chose you to inherit everything." I nodded. He was thinking far ahead. Gilbert pressed his lips together, his voice lower. "Not just far. He saw something very few in your family ever did. Quiet loyalty, not needing praise. You were there not to demand, but to listen. That's why he left it all to you." I glanced out the window of his office. The traffic still flowed along the avenue. The city still hurried by, unaware that in this quiet room, a woman now held not just documents but the truth hidden for years. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt heavy. But it was the weight of someone carrying the responsibility they were meant to. And I knew Evelyn and Crystal wouldn't stop, not until they'd exhausted every angle. But I had everything I needed in my hands, and more importantly, in my mind. No one could twist the truth when it was written in every line, in every word of the man who was gone. I didn't need to say much. I just needed to keep going and wait for them to face what they themselves had created. The extended meeting took place on a Thursday morning in the 19th floor conference room of Evans Holdings, headquarters in Manhattan's financial district. I entered as the clock struck 8:30. Men in gray suits and women in dark blazers nodded politely, but I saw the flicker of doubt in their eyes. Rumors traveled faster than financial reports. I stood at the head of the long table beside Attorney Gilbert. Across from us sat my mother and Crystal, with their attorney, a sharp-looking woman in her mid-30s, dark hair tied back, gaze filled with disdain when she looked at me. The chair of the meeting, Harold Brenner, an old board member and longtime friend of Richard, cleared his throat and shuffled a few papers. We are here today to clarify the legal and ethical validity of the transfer of control from the late Chairman Richard Evans to his direct heir, Ms. Autumn Evans. I sat tall, hands resting lightly on the table, neither clenched nor shaking. Years of silence had taught me, resolve doesn't require raising your voice. My mother suddenly rose before anyone else could speak. She didn't look at me, but at the shareholders. I am Richard Evans's only daughter, she declared, her voice ringing like a campaign speech. I cared for him in his frailty, stood by him when he needed support, was his companion in his final years. Crystal sat beside my mother, nodding repeatedly, occasionally whispering to her attorney. My mother's voice grew sharper, rising higher with each word. And Autumn? She left home before even finishing college. She's lived apart, never caring about family. And suddenly, just because of a few quick visits, she gets full control of my father's estate? That is completely unfair. A few shareholders began murmuring. One man leaned toward his neighbor and shrugged. I looked around the room, then slowly reached into my leather bag and pulled out a thick, neatly clipped file, placing it on the table. With your permission, I'd like to speak, I said, my voice not loud but steady. All eyes turned toward me. I nodded at Mr. Harold, then looked directly at each person in the room. For the past 8 years, I have traveled to Albany at least twice a month. Richard Evans was not just my grandfather, he was my teacher. He taught me step by step how to build, manage, and protect the true value of a business. I opened the file, pulled out account statements and loan documents in my mother's name, and laid each page across the glass table face up. These are copies of loans Mrs. Evelyn Evans took out over the last 10 years, most of them to pay gambling debts and risky investments. At one point, she even mortgaged assets in my grandfather's name without his written consent. The room fell silent. I heard Crystal inhale sharply. I turned to my mother, speaking slowly. Do you remember the loan at Empire Capital Lending in 2018? You used his name as guarantor. And the one in Atlantic City, you forged his signature. Evelyn's face flushed. She shook her head, mouth opening as if to speak, but I didn't let her interrupt. I pressed play on a recorder that Attorney Gilbert had extracted from the encrypted drive. Grandpa Richard's voice filled the still air, clear and firm. If anyone questions my decision, let them hear this. Evelyn is no longer disciplined or fit to manage the assets. I watched her treat the family's wealth like her personal wallet. Autumn is the only one who never asked me for a single dollar, who never dismissed the work I put in. I trust her because I taught her with my own 2 hands. Someone raised a hand to cover their mouth. A few major shareholders exchanged tense looks. I stopped the recorder and set it back on the table. What I present is not to prove who is right or wrong. I am simply presenting the truth. And I have a responsibility to protect what my grandfather spent his life building. Not because I am the heir, but because I know exactly where every dollar in this trust came from, how it was used, and how it must be preserved. Evelyn froze in place. Words failed her. Crystal stared down at her hands, fingers clenched tightly beneath the table. The atmosphere in the room was no longer just tense, it was the collective recognition that the illusions they had clung to were crumbling, piece by piece, beyond repair. Mr. Harold Brenner placed his hand on the table, his voice deliberate. We questioned the sudden shift in control. But what Ms. Autumn has just presented, both legally and ethically, shows this decision was based on sound reason. And perhaps it is the right decision. I didn't smile. I didn't shed a tear. I simply nodded, feeling neither triumphant nor relieved. Just clear. Clear as the way my grandfather once looked at me on that last autumn afternoon on the porch, when he handed me a key and said, "Not every child is fit to carry the family legacy, but you are ready. And you understand it more deeply than anyone else ever could." I hadn't expected Crystal to be reckless enough to go that far. Barely 3 weeks after the shareholder meeting, just as things seemed to settle, I received an email with the subject line, "Urgent documents, request for strategic partnership confirmation." The sender was a company called Edgeford Capital, unfamiliar at first glance, but the message was polished and professional, with an 8-page preliminary contract attached. They proposed buying into a housing project in Westchester that our company was developing at nearly 40% below market value. I frowned as I reached the section, "Per agreement reached with secondary shareholder representative, Ms. Crystal Evans, we believe this deal has received internal approval." Crystal? I immediately forwarded the contract to Attorney Gilbert. Less than 3 hours later, he called me back, his voice edged with frustration. "Autumn, this is a forged contract. The company logo is real, but the legal structure is completely invalid. Crystal has no authority to represent any shares. Every single one has been legally transferred to you. We need to confirm immediately whether anyone has been duped into signing under the table." A chill ran down my spine. If anyone signed this, it wouldn't just cause financial loss, it would make my leadership look like a joke. A brand new CEO allowing her younger sister to meddle in internal finances. It would be seen as incompetence, lack of control, and a red flag for strategic investors. I said nothing. I quietly reopened the project folders, comparing each clause of the forged contract. And I knew Crystal couldn't have pulled this off alone. She had never read a contract without asking my mother 3 times. Someone else was behind this, someone who knew the law, understood our internal processes, and had ties close enough to reach Edgeford Capital. 3 days later, I got my answer. A call came from Michael Sterling, CEO of Sterling Realty, one of Grandpa Richard's long-term partners. I had met him a few times during signings, and a year earlier I had helped him resolve a complex contract issue with a bank when his old lawyer left mid-case. That day, I hadn't spoken much, just quietly found him a replacement lawyer, reviewed the documents, and delivered everything on time. His voice was calm but steady. "Autumn, there's something you should know. A week ago, Crystal contacted us. She claimed to represent a secondary shareholding branch of Evans Holdings, offering to sell our Westchester stake. At first, I thought she was working with you, but when she dodged questions, I grew suspicious. We dug deeper, there was no authorization at all. When I pressed her, she dodged and hung up. I tightened my grip on the phone. Thank you for trusting me. Not just trust. I worked with Richard for nearly 30 years. He never gave his confidence lightly. But he chose you, and now I see why." Right after that call, I ordered an emergency meeting with legal, risk management, and communications teams. We worked for 6 straight hours. Every email, phone log, and document tied to Edgeford Capital was reviewed, archived, and prepared for formal response. I also had a statement sent to every stakeholder involved in related projects, reaffirming the sole legal authority of my leadership, backed by shareholder resolutions. Crystal never expected me to respond so quickly. The very next day, a headline appeared on a respected financial news site. Evans Holdings confirms attempted contract forgery issues, investor warning over unauthorized approach by unaccredited individual. Beneath it was my statement. We have always prioritized transparency and ethics in all operations. Exploiting family ties for personal gain not only causes financial harm, but also gravely violates trust within the business community. Soon after, Crystal was removed from every professional group she had once been part of. Several cosmetic brands quietly cut ties. Social media posts praising her went silent. Those who had once cheered her fell quiet, even deleting old comments. Some of her closest friends publicly expressed disappointment at being dragged into half-truths and fabrications. I said nothing further. I kept working. I kept managing. Every morning, I stood before the project boards with coffee in hand, quietly cleaning up what they had left behind in the wreckage of greed. One late afternoon, as I prepared to leave, I saw Crystal waiting in the lobby. Her face was pale, her hair disheveled, her usual stilettos replaced with worn sneakers. She walked toward me, eyes downcast, and whispered, "You ruined me." I answered evenly, "I didn't do anything. You did this to yourself." She didn't reply. I watched her walk out, swallowed into the stream of people flowing into the streets, the evening sun stretching long across her shoulders. I couldn't tell whether the fading shadow belonged to Crystal or to a piece of childhood I had once clung to, hoping it might still hold light. The news of my mother's bankruptcy was made official on a Monday morning, in a filing submitted by her attorneys to the county court. Evelyn Evans applied for Chapter 13 protection, listing over 6 unpaid loans, 3 credit contracts ruled fraudulent, and a long roster of personal creditors, including casinos in Atlantic City and Las Vegas. I received a copy of the filing from our internal legal team. I wasn't surprised. What struck me most was the timing. Nearly the same day I formally stepped into my role as CEO of Evans Holdings. The very things my mother once treated as toys, signatures, seals, contracts were now my daily reality. That same day, I received a large envelope with no return name, only an address handwritten in familiar script: Morbay Pinecrest Lane, my grandfather's old house. Inside was a stack of unopened debt collection letters addressed to my mother. I guessed a postal worker or an old neighbor had sent them. I didn't read them all. Just one from a credit company called Ridge West Finance was enough to stop me. It read, "We will pursue legal action if the borrower fails to fulfill payment obligations within 7 days of receiving this notice. Assets transferred through inheritance may be reconsidered if fraud is discovered in prior ownership." I locked the documents in the safe, then opened the window and looked down at the traffic below. There was no satisfaction in it. The truth was, I felt nothing clear when I thought of my mother anymore. No hatred, no anger. Just a sense that the woman who had once been the center of so much chaos in my life had dissolved into a distant echo in an empty room. A few days later, I heard that Crystal had applied for a waitress job at a small diner in South Brooklyn. The news came from a former media associate of hers, who sent me a leaked internal message. Crystal Evans, once known for her glamorous lifestyle, is now officially an employee at Luna Deli, responsible for making coffee and wiping tables. I didn't care where she was working. What weighed on me more was the way people reacted. Those who once flattered her, who used her as their ticket to attention, now mocked her. Someone snapped a picture of her from behind and posted it with the caption, "The queen of the runway is now the queen of wiping tables." I read it, then deleted it. I never shared things like that. Even though Crystal had chosen a path that pushed me to the edge, I never wanted to see my sister humiliated that way. Crystal's mistakes were grave, but they didn't deserve to be ripped apart as the target of a mob's anger. Some wounds, I believed, only time could treat better than ridicule. Meanwhile, I stepped into the role of CEO at a pace I never imagined for myself. Every morning, my schedule was packed: meetings with finance to approve the quarterly operating budget, checking on the construction progress of the housing development in Syracuse, reviewing the digital marketing strategy for the luxury real estate system we had just acquired in New Jersey. I learned to make decisions within 5 minutes when urgent reports came in, and I learned to stay silent for 10 minutes if the person across from me hadn't finished their thought. The lessons Richard once taught me during long afternoons of quiet talks were coming back to life more tangibly than ever, not through words, but through pressure. Some nights I stayed alone in the office after everyone had left. The glass walls opened to the glittering lights of the Brooklyn Bridge, but it no longer looked beautiful to me. I thought of him how he used to sit in that small room in Albany with no soundproof glass, no leather chairs, no modern gadgets, just printouts, a fountain pen, and the weight of silence. I pulled his photo from my drawer and placed it beside my computer. In it, he was staring into the reader. Distance, holding a cup of tea, a faint smile on his lips. "I'm trying every day, Grandpa." I whispered it softly, with no need for anyone else to hear. One Friday afternoon, just as I was about to leave, the receptionist handed me a hand-delivered envelope. No name, only a folded sheet of paper with handwriting. I recognized instantly. "Autumn, if you're reading this, it means you've done something I never could, stood on your own 2 feet." I was wrong. Not because I left nothing for you, but because I never saw who you had become. If I could turn back time, I would ask for forgiveness. But I won't demand it. I only ask that you live true to what your grandfather believed in. Evelyn. I sat still for a long time after reading it. No tears, no smile. Just a deep release inside me, as if I had put down a weight I never knew I'd been carrying all those years. She was still my mother. And even though she had never protected me, I wouldn't let that turn me into the kind of person she once was. I could do better. Not through revenge, but by living kinder, truer, and stronger. Perhaps that was the clearest proof that I hadn't been shaped by wounds, but by persistence, and Richard, though gone, was still present in every decision I made. I sat quietly in my new office on the top floor of Evans Holdings headquarters, the glass wall behind me opening onto a city shifting toward winter. The late light swept across rooftops, scattering pale gold across the Hudson River. On my desk, beside my computer and the stack of files awaiting my signature, sat an old wooden frame. Inside was my grandfather, Richard Evans, with that calm smile, that steady, knowing gaze. I looked into his eyes, not to search for answers this time, but to give thanks. "I haven't let you down," I whispered, like a promise that needed no reply. Nearly a year since I took over, my life had been a breathless rush of schedules, yet never once did I wake to emptiness. On the way, contrary, each step through the hallways, each handshake with a partner, each signed investment decision reminded me of him, the man who had prepared me not only with knowledge of management but also with patience, quiet strength, and principle that no words could replace. Even in a world that ran on money, he made me believe there were values that outlasted numbers. That's why I chose to dedicate a portion of profits from 2 major real estate projects this year to establish a scholarship fund in his name, the Richard Evans Foundation for Lost Children. I didn't choose elite schools or target the students with the highest GPAs. I wanted to start with the children labeled as burdens, the ones abandoned in nursing homes, orphanages, or families with no room for silence. The fund would not only provide tuition, but also long-term mentorship from psychologists, educators, and those who had once walked through struggles like mine. "Not everyone born into a family is raised with love," I wrote in the fund's opening speech. "But everyone deserves to see their own worth." The news of the foundation spread quickly in the business community and local media. Some expressed surprise, even asked why I didn't keep investing in stocks or real estate. I only smiled lightly and gave no answer. They didn't understand, and I didn't need them to. The office door opened softly. Julia, my assistant, hesitated, then spoke in a low voice. "Miss Autumn, there are 2 people downstairs. They didn't schedule, but they insist on seeing you. It's Mrs. Evelyn and Ms. Crystal." I lifted my head. For a moment I was silent, not out of shock, but because some part of me had always hoped this meeting would come at a time that didn't carry the weight of apology. "Send them up," I said. Minutes later, they walked in. Crystal trailed behind, thinner, her hair tied back, no makeup. My mother sat opposite me, her eyes no longer proud, but heavy with exhaustion from months of struggle. "Can we talk?" she asked. I nodded. Crystal wouldn't look at me. Her voice was small, almost breaking mid-sentence. "I'm sorry for everything." I was foolish and selfish. I didn't react. I only listened. My mother continued, slowly, each word seeming carved out of pride. I didn't come for money. I just wanted to say that I've read everything you've done. I've seen how you didn't just keep the company alive, but turned it into something your grandfather would be proud of. If you allow it, I'd like to have a place, even the smallest one, in your life. I sat in silence for a long time. The years of being called a burden, the glares, the cutting words, the forgotten birthdays, all of it flashed through my mind like an old film without sound. I didn't feel the need to punish them anymore, but I couldn't return naively either. I looked at them, my voice gentle but firm. The door is open, but not for you to treat family as a bank anymore. They didn't answer. Crystal nodded, tears brimming. My mother bowed her head, then rose, saying nothing further. As they left, I didn't turn back, not because I was angry, but because I had chosen to keep walking forward. I returned to my desk and glanced once more at my grandfather's photo. Inside, there was no storm, only the quiet relief of something finally closed the right way. Not everyone needs to prove themselves through revenge. Some simply need to live rightly, stand firmly, and endure the noise, and that is victory enough. I don't need the whole world to understand that, just the one man who once believed in me. And I hadn't let him down. True power isn't in material inheritance, it's in how you remain decent when you could have become anything else. And if there's one thing this journey taught me, it's that silence is not weakness, and forgiveness is not forgetting. Forgiveness is knowing everything, yet choosing not to let it destroy what you're building. And that's the choice I made. I don't know how what I've shared will strike others. Maybe to some, it's just another messy family story of conflict, greed, and fallout. But if you've ever grown up in the silence of being dismissed, if you've ever fought to be recognized, not to outshine anyone, but simply to protect what was right, maybe you'll understand how I lived through it. I don't tell this story to condemn my mother, nor to accuse my sister. I tell it because I believe each of us has a part of life that deserves to be seen, whether it's the pain or the resilience that made us rise. Family isn't perfect, but if we dare face the truth and act with integrity, sooner or later, the winds shift. What do you think of what happened with me, with Evelyn and Crystal? If it were you, would you forgive as I did, or would you have chosen another path? I truly want to hear your thoughts. Share them in the comments below. Because sometimes another person's story helps us shine a light on our own. And if this story touched something in your heart, don't forget to follow the channel to keep exploring with me the many layers of family life where broken bonds might still find a way to grow into kindness. Because in the end, everyone deserves to be heard. And sometimes that is where change begins.